Right, to take this conversation further, we now speak to children's rights activist, Dr Siyabonga Nzimande. Dr Nzimande, appreciate your time today. Just your reaction to 42 life terms for Nkosinathi Phakathi.
Thank you so much, Hugo, and greetings to your viewers as well. I think one welcomes the sentencing and also want to give credit where it's due within the South African justice system. And we hope that this is not just going to be one example, but it's going to be many other cases that actually have been sitting and not being finalized and justice still not being served. And I think this is quite critical, actually, when we're speaking about the psychosocial support that is needed. We can provide as much as we can, psychosocial support to the sexual violence victims and survivors. But when justice is still not served, it still lingers as something that still needs a lot of focus when it comes to psychosocial as well as mental detrimental, or how it is detrimental into their mental health. So we welcome it, but at the same time, I think that moving to goal number 5 of our sustainable development goals, which is really looking at gender equality, we still have a long way to go in terms of eliminating all forms of violence against women, against girls in public and private sphere, including trafficking as well as sexual and other types of exploitation. It means that we really need to go back and revisit what is it that we still need to do when we're talking about sexual violence prevention programs. And we welcome the sentencing, as I'm saying, but I'm also beginning to really want to stir a conversation that says there are many other perpetrators out there who are still not found. There are many other victims out there who still need counseling, who is still not, justice is still not served, and something has to be done in that regard.
Let's unpack this a little bit, Dr Nzimande, and bring things into perspective. So for a start, there were 96 dockets, and I'd like to imagine that the 96 represents the number of cases or similar cases that were being examined. The first case, or the first report, was in 2012. It took somewhere within, I think, 10 or 11 years, so it was 2021 or thereabouts when he was finally apprehended. And when the judge was reading out the sentence, she went through to count number 188 and beyond, right? So this perpetrator was out there in this community for this length of time. Now, what's your take on policing? What's your take on what the South African Police Service is doing to enhance community safety? One would imagine that very little from the fact that this took 10 years for this individual to be apprehended.
I think that's why we saw thousands of women across the country who were marching and calling it a total shutdown. And then we birthed something that we call the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. And President Ramaphosa, in his opening remarks of that document, he speaks about that there's an urgent need to respond to victims and survivors of GBV. I'm not really at liberty to say that I blame that, but I'm also feeling that number 1 should also be the prosecution. I think number 2, he speaks about broadening the access to justice for survivors. And I think we need an urgent response in terms of the South African police services and how they respond as a justice system entirely to gender-based violence, to sexual violence cases. And there need to be an extra watch in terms of these committees that sit within GBV response systems that need to bring accountability. One must always really look at, when we're speaking about gender-based violence, we always want to put up numbers and we say South Africa is leading, Gauteng is leading, KZN is following, and all of that. But what we're beginning to not realize is that behind these numbers, there are human beings. So an urgent response is needed. And also I would say there was a lack from the South African police services accountability structures in terms of ensuring justice. And also really we want to commend and really applaud the victims that were part of the investigations, but we're saying something could have happened quicker. And even if you look at from 2012 to 2021, one is really beginning to ask the question, within the 188 accounts that were mentioned in court yesterday, one is it also beginning to question and say, between 2012 and 2021, how many more other victims were still being actually victimized and still actually being violated. So an urgent response from South African police services is needed in such cases. And we need to put civil society in the forefront to fight this, because I always say government cannot account on its own. We need movements of organizations, of community members to put up that constituency and say, we are going to be the watchdog of gender-based violence within our wards, within our communities, and will ensure that there is justice at the end of the day.
Now, Dr. Nzimande, if we go back to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and use that as an illustration of being faced with a challenge and acting upon it, what comes to mind is in June 2020, if I'm not mistaken, where President Cyril Ramaphosa likened GBV to a second pandemic. Now, my question to you is just what work has been done by national government since that announcement where GBV was likened to a pandemic, and that's about 4 years ago, if my math serves me correctly, to date?
You see what we did well with COVID, and also looking at COVID as a national threat, and I'm going to relate that to gender-based violence. The good thing that was done was that there was a command center. And I do agree that there is a command center for gender-based violence. But one is beginning to question its activity and how active it is to be able to bring about the catalytic a movement of ensuring that there's justice within these cases. I would say we are still lacking much more accountability in the programming in how we are responding to gender-based violence. We should not plug in GBV and sexual violence as an additional ad hoc program when we are programming into the social structural drivers, even of HIV and AIDS, of new infections. GBV is still the leading one when we are speaking to that. So I'm saying that we still need to be more proactive in how we are accounting in terms of these cases that are being reported, but we still need to move beyond just cases that are reported and looking at access to justice. What I would say about, in particular for me, is the prevention method. There are many programs in South Africa that are looking at a girl child and empowering a woman child. Many perpetrators of gender-based violence and sexual violence are males, and they begin from ages of 15. Human Science Research Council give us that stat. What programming should be in place that speaks to a young man and says, don't rape, it is disgusting? What programs are talking to men, not just emotionally? Say, we see the Ismaya Samadoda, where they bring young men to come and talk, but we need to really break it down into saying, we're getting men to speak about the things that they do in their corners that build up in their psychosis that makes them look as if now raping is cool. And at the same time, while I'm advocating for programming for boys to correct the behavior that currently exists and seek mental health for those, because if you listen to this case of Phakathi, you'll hear that this person is beyond rehabilitation. How do you get to a point where you've got an individual who's beyond rehabilitation? Where are the services in the community that are supposed to speak into the holistic approach of how we deal with gender-based violence, not just focusing on women alone, but also focusing on men and targeting men and speaking strongly into the roots of that? And I think we need to add that. We need to amplify that within our programming.
All right, now finally, in your view, does the current judicial response adequately address the severity of crimes committed against children?
No, it doesn't. If we're still getting a number of children that are pregnant at age of 9 and we report them as deliveries in our public hospitals, something is not right. We are not doing the right thing. We should be not speaking about the number of deliveries. We should be talking about how many were prosecuted, how many were found to be guilty. Because if a 9-year-old is pregnant in South Africa, we report it. And it comes across in our dashboards when we sit in these meetings, and we find it to be like, wait a minute, why are we talking about it as a health threat that a 9-year-old has given birth? Why are we not talking about the justice system that need to be behind that number, that speaks into justice system, human right violation, that speaks into these cases being properly adjudicated? And therefore, I think as civil society and also as an activist within the children's rights, I think this is where one is really cringing and saying, when are we going to go back and revisit what we think works, and how are we going to mitigate, and how are we going to eliminate? And there is more need for us to strengthen the existing architecture, as President Cyril Ramaphosa put it very well in his welcoming remarks of the NSP, that we need to broaden that. I think not just broadening it, we need to strengthen the criminal justice system when it comes to sexual violence in South Africa.
Dr. Siyabonga Nzimande, that's where we'll leave that conversation, reacting to that sentencing of multiple life terms and given to Nkosinathi Phakathi, 42 life terms for rape. Appreciate your time.